In a world on the brink of transformation, where shadows of empires loom large, a fierce leader rises to reshape the destiny of a fractured realm. This is the saga of Clovis I, the Merovingian king whose ambitions ignited the spark of a powerful kingdom amidst the chaos of the late Roman Empire. As the last vestiges of Roman authority crumbled, the land fell prey to a relentless struggle, a brutal clash of tribes fighting for supremacy. The Franks, once mere footnotes in history, stood poised to ascend, their fates intertwined with the echoes of their past. With each battle fought and each alliance forged, a new order emerged from the ashes of ancient glory. In this episode, we unravel the epic tale of Clovis I's rise, a story filled with bloodshed, betrayal, and the unyielding pursuit of power. From the fierce tribal warfare of the Germanic peoples to the transformative shift that would define a nation, Clovis's journey is one of relentless ambition and ruthless determination. This is not just the tale of a king, it is the story of a people caught in the throes of upheaval, where loyalty is tested and destinies are forged in the fires of conflict. Join us as we delve into the dramatic history of Clovis I and the rise of the Franks, a chapter that forever altered the course of medieval Europe. Today, we'll explore the origins of one of the most influential dynasties in European late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, the Merovingians. After a brief look at the beginnings of the Franks, we'll dive into the lives of their first known rulers, focusing on the first two Merovingians, Childeric and, most importantly, his son Clovis. But before we begin, I have a question for you. Do you know how the last Merovingian ruler ended his career in 752? Stay with me until the end of this video and I'll tell you the unusual story of how his power was taken from him. We'll hear about it through the words of one of Europe's leading historians of the Middle Ages, Dan Jones. The story of the Franks begins long before their rise to power under Clovis I. From their early appearances in Roman texts to their dominance over much of Western Europe, the Franks played a crucial role in shaping medieval society. Their journey from scattered Germanic tribes on the Roman frontier to founding the influential Merovingian dynasty is a tale of ambition, strategy, and adaptation. Let's explore their origins through the lens of leading historians and trace the pivotal moments that led to their ascent. The first records of the Franks date back to the 3rd century CE, when Roman sources mention them as Germanic tribes living near the Lower Rhine. The Roman historian Tacitus, in his work Germania, provides one of the earliest glimpses of these people. However, his descriptions remain brief, as the Franks were not yet a unified force. But by the reign of Emperor Valentinian III, the Franks were no longer just peripheral tribes. They had become Rome's allies, or Federati. In return for military service, the Franks, particularly the Salian Franks, were granted land in Roman territory, including parts of modern-day northern France and Belgium. According to Paul Friedman, a professor of medieval history at Yale, this arrangement marked a turning point for the Franks, setting them on the path toward greater power. As Rome's power waned, the Franks seized their opportunity to emerge as a dominant force. During this period of alliance with the crumbling Roman Empire, the Franks played a key role in defending the Roman frontier, especially against the Huns. In exchange for land and influence, they fought alongside Roman generals like Aetius, notably at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, 451 AD, where they helped repel the Huns. Historian Mark Bloch, in his seminal work Feudal Society, highlights how these military arrangements between the Franks and the Romans were crucial in shaping Frankish customs and governance. The Salian Franks, under leaders like Childeric I, began to adopt aspects of Roman culture while retaining their distinct tribal identity. This process of Romanization, Bloch argues, laid the foundation for the feudal structures that would dominate medieval Europe. The Franks were beginning to create a hybrid society, one that combined Germanic customs with Roman political structures. All sources and further readings from Mark Bloch, Georges Duby, Chris Wickham and other historians mentioned in this video will be linked in the description below. None of these links are affiliate links, and they are provided purely for educational purposes to help you dive deeper into the fascinating history of the Franks. The Franks were not a single unified group, but consisted of two primary branches, the Salian Franks and the Ripuarian Franks. Salian Franks has settled in northern France and Belgium. The Salians were integrated into Roman society as Federati. Their proximity to Roman lands led them to adopt Roman customs and military tactics. Under Childeric I and his son Clovis I, the Salian Franks rose to prominence, particularly through Clovis's eventual conversion to Christianity and his alignment with the Roman Church. In contrast, the Ripuarian Franks lived on the eastern bank of the Rhine, in what is now modern-day Germany. They remained less influenced by Roman culture initially, maintaining a more independent and traditional tribal structure. Over time, they were absorbed into the Merovingian kingdom as Clovis consolidated power. Chris Wickham in The Inheritance of Rome provides a comprehensive overview of how the Franks transitioned from a loose confederation of tribes into a formidable power in Western Europe. Wickham emphasizes that the Franks' rise was not inevitable, but was facilitated by the weakening of Roman authority, which created a power vacuum that Clovis was able to fill through both military conquest and strategic alliances. The rise of the Franks culminated in the reign of Childeric I, the first known king of the Salian Franks, who played a key role in expanding Frankish power. His son, Clovis I, would be the one to truly transform the Franks into a dominant force, founding the Merovingian dynasty. Under Clovis's leadership, the Franks conquered neighboring tribes, defeated the last remnants of Roman power in Gaul, and laid the groundwork for a united Frankish kingdom. Georges Duby, in his work The Age of the Cathedrals, touches on how the Merovingian and Carolingian dynasties influenced the development of European social structures. While Duby primarily focuses on art and architecture, he underscores the importance of the Frankish period in shaping the political and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. The legacy of Clovis and his successors can be seen not only in the consolidation of the Frankish kingdom, but also in the religious and cultural institutions that would dominate Europe for centuries. The story of the Franks is one of transformation, from minor players on the Roman frontier to rulers of a vast and powerful kingdom. Through their strategic alliance with Rome, their victories on the battlefield, and their adoption of Roman legal and military practices, the Franks laid the foundation for what would become medieval European society. As Clovis united the Frankish tribes and established the Merovingian dynasty, he set the stage for centuries of Frankish dominance. And as we look ahead to Clovis's dramatic rise, remember the question from earlier: what happened to the last Merovingian ruler? Stay with us, as we'll soon reveal how one very usual and normal event for almost every one of us today marked the symbolic end of this once mighty dynasty, with insights from the renowned historian Dan Jones. In the mid-4th century, Emperor Valentinian III made a strategic decision that would shape the course of European history. He settled the Salian Franks in northern Gaul as Federati, allied tribes tasked with defending Roman territories. This arrangement was crucial, as Rome's power in the region was declining and external threats were mounting. According to Chris Wickham, the settlement of the Franks as Federati signalled the start of their power consolidation in Gaul, particularly under Childeric and his son Clovis. Childeric, believed to have reigned from AD 458 to 481, emerged as a key leader during these turbulent times. His control extended across modern-day Belgium and northern France, a region that allowed him to navigate relations with both Roman authorities and neighbouring tribes. Ian Wood notes that Childeric's ability to balance Roman alliances and manage internal conflicts was crucial in establishing the Merovingian dynasty's power. Remember, Childeric's story doesn't end with his reign. There's an intriguing mystery about his grave that we'll reveal soon. Despite a brief period of exile due to personal misconduct, Childeric regained his throne with the help of loyal supporters. His leadership laid the groundwork for the rise of the Frankish kingdom, which his son, Clovis, would later expand into a unified and powerful realm. Clovis would also align the Franks with the Roman Catholic Church, a decision that had lasting repercussions for the future of Europe. Childeric's legacy is significant, not just because he was a successful military leader, but because of his role as the progenitor of the Merovingian dynasty. His son Clovis would go on to establish a unified Frankish kingdom, laying the foundations for medieval France. Childeric's grave, discovered in the 17th century, revealed artifacts that highlighted the wealth and status of the Merovingian kings. As prominent British historian Dan Jones states in his book Powers and Thrones, Childeric's grave tells us the Franks were more than wandering warlords. According to Jones, as early as the late 5th century, their rulers had all the appurtenances of kingship and saw themselves as commanders of lands stretching many days' ride in all directions. Yet, in 1831, after his death, as we move forward, keep in mind that we still need to answer that question. How did the last Merovingian king lose his power? Stay with us until the end for the full story. Clovis I, the son of Childeric, emerged as one of the most important figures in the history of the Franks. His reign from AD 481 to AD 511 transformed the Franks from a collection of tribes into a powerful and united kingdom. Clovis's success was built on a foundation of military brilliance and strategic alliances, enabling him to expand Frankish control over much of Gaul. His most notable military achievement came at the Battle of Vouillé in AD 507, where he defeated the Visigothic king Alaric II, securing dominance over southwestern Gaul. However, it was not only his military victories that ensured his lasting legacy. Clovis's decision to convert to Christianity, as chronicled by Gregory of Tours, was a turning point for both the Franks and European history. Gregory notes, Clovis converted to Christianity at the urging of his wife Clotilde, after witnessing the power of the Christian God in battle. Queen Clotilde, Clovis's wife, and a devout Catholic from the Burgundian royal family, was a central figure in persuading him to embrace Christianity. Historian Chris Wickham points out that Clotilde's role was critical. She introduced Christianity into the Frankish court, persistently advocating for its acceptance despite the political and cultural challenges. Clovis, however, initially resisted her efforts to convert him from his pagan beliefs. The dramatic turning point came in 496 AD during the Battle of Tolbiac against the Alemanni. As Clovis's army was on the verge of defeat, he prayed to the Christian God for victory, promising to convert if successful. Following his victory, Clovis honoured his vow and was baptized in Reims by St. Remigius in a ceremony attended by thousands. Historian Ian Wood highlights that this moment was a masterstroke of political genius, as it not only legitimized Clovis's rule, but also distinguished the Franks from other Germanic tribes, many of whom followed Arian Christianity, which was at odds with the Roman Catholic Church. Clotilde's influence did not go unrecognized, and she was later canonized as a saint. According to Dan Jones, she is patron saint of brides and adopted children. Her faith and persistence played a vital role in establishing the Merovingian dynasty as a cornerstone of Catholic Europe. The impact of Clovis's conversion extended far beyond religious matters. By embracing Catholicism, Clovis secured the support of the Roman Church and set the Franks apart from the Arian Christian kingdoms surrounding them. This alliance with the Church gave Clovis's kingdom both political legitimacy and spiritual backing, a foundation that would continue to shape the future of medieval Europe. Yet, Clovis was not just a king who used diplomacy and faith to expand his power. He was also a ruthless tactician. Gregory of Tours recounts how Clovis systematically eliminated his rivals, including his own relatives, to secure sole control over the Frankish kingdom. This mix of brutal efficiency and religious piety helped to consolidate his reign and shape the future of the Frankish Empire. One of Clovis's most enduring contributions was the creation of the Lex Salica, Salic law, a legal code that governed the Frankish kingdom. This law dealt with issues such as inheritance, land ownership, and crime, and its influence can be seen in the legal systems of medieval Europe. Clovis's efforts laid the groundwork for a unified kingdom that would eventually become one of the most powerful in Europe. Don't forget, we still owe you the answer to that intriguing question from the start. What happened to the last Merovingian king, and how did his reign end? Before we wrap up, let's address the mystery we teased at the beginning of this video. What happened to the last Merovingian king? As you've learned throughout this journey, long hair wasn't just a fashion statement for the Merovingians. It was a powerful symbol of royal authority. Every Merovingian king wore his hair long as a sign of his divine right to rule. But in 752 AD, the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, met an unusual and symbolic end to his reign. He wasn't deposed by sword or battle. Instead, his long hair was cut by the order of Pippin the Short, about whom we will hear very shortly, stripping him of his royal power and marking the final fall of the Merovingian dynasty. This story exemplifies the importance of symbols in the medieval world. With one haircut, centuries of royal tradition came to a close, and the stage was set for the rise of a new dynasty under Pepin the Short and later Charlemagne. Now, let's recap the key takeaways from our exploration today. The rise of Clovis I. We explored how Clovis emerged as a powerful leader, uniting the Franks and expanding their kingdom. Conversion to Christianity. Clovis's strategic decision to convert to Christianity played a monumental role in aligning his kingdom with the Roman Catholic Church, solidifying the Merovingian dynasty's power in Europe. The legacy of Clovis's reforms, his establishment of Salic law and military conquests, set the foundation for what would later become medieval France. Clovis I may have been a warrior king, but his decisions resonated far beyond his lifetime, shaping the political and cultural future of Europe for centuries. The story of the Merovingians is far from over, and in our next video, we'll dive deep into the downfall of this iconic dynasty and the rise of the Carolingians. So if you're ready to continue this journey into the fascinating history of medieval Europe, be sure to watch our next video about the end of the Merovingians. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your fellow history buffs, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to study the history of the Franks more in depth with books and videos listed in description. You will have a great time. Winter is coming, so plenty of time. See you in the next chapter of European history.